Welcome back to the show. I am really glad that you're here. This is my first time recording from my home. And honestly, it's because I was having technical difficulties with internet at the office. So, not only do I have this cool background, if you're watching this on video, my cat will also most likely make an appearance. So, that's awesome. That'll be fun times. But, we're all about being flexible and adaptable around here. I am really excited to welcome Tanya today. We are going to have some amazing conversations about parenting neurodivergent kids. And I always love having moms on the show because I'm not a mom. And so it really just gives everything a perspective that I am not able to share. But of course, I have the experience of being a neurodivergent kid and being parented when I was a kid. So I'm really glad to have this conversation with Tanya Valentin. And I'm going to let her introduce herself and then we will jump right in. So, Tanya, please tell us all about you.
Hi everyone. So my name's Tanya. I'm from New Zealand, and I'm a neurodivergent person myself. I'm both autistic and have ADHD. And I also am a parent of three neurodivergent humans. So my eldest is 21, my youngest is 14. And we only found out that we were all neurodivergent within sort of the last 5 years. So it's been quite an interesting discovery journey for us all as a family. And I also work here in New Zealand, but also in the global community to help parents who perhaps are finding out later in life or with their children, because a lot of children still get diagnosed later, especially girls and AFAB. And so I help parents to perhaps look at ways that they can adapt their parenting, and just parent in a more neuro-affirming way, to support their children, because we all know if we, those of us who were diagnosed later in life, how hard it can be being a neurodivergent child, growing up in a neurotypical world and having a lot of demands and things put on you, um, not taking into account your autism or your ADHD. And it can have a really detrimental effect on you as a person, and cause a lot of trauma. So it's kind of like my little mission in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you have created a role and a position for yourself where you're able to support other parents in the same way. And can I ask, I know that it's actually pretty common for parents, especially moms, to realize their own neurodivergence when their kids get diagnosed. So can I ask, was that the journey for you? Did it come from your kids being diagnosed?
Absolutely. So, um, you know, it's kind of funny because you don't actually realize, like, I didn't realize that I was neurodivergent, but I always kind of had this experience of feeling like I just didn't fit anywhere. It was very hard for me socially or to make friends, or, it kind of just sort of felt out of place a lot in my life. I had a lot of trauma growing up as well. Even though my parents are really lovely, I just kind of felt like they perhaps didn't understand me or get me. Um, and then my own children, when they became teenagers, it was really hard for them as well. We had a lot of mental health issues, depression, anxiety. Um, One of my children was very suicidal at one point. And so we like, taking them to counselors and doctors and, trying to find support, and whatever was we were supporting them with, or whatever people suggested, or medications, none of it was working. And so eventually we got in touch with a psychologist who was a female, and she said, I think maybe your children might be autistic. Um, and I was just blown away because I hadn't even, like, you have this picture in your head about what autism looks like.
Yeah.
I am an educator, and so I'd been in contact with a lot of autistic boys in early childhood, but never any autistic girls. And so it was just like a huge, like, awakening for our whole family. And then I did what a lot of neurodivergent people do, like just jump headfirst into researching things. As a mum, I really wanted to support my children. And so as I was discovering stuff about them and their autistic traits, and ways to support them, like huge light bulb moments were going off for me as well. And I realized that actually, as my children were growing up and they were saying, oh, I don't have friends, or this is hard for me, I was saying things to them like, oh, that's normal. And not actually realizing that actually, no, that's not normal. It's just normal for me because I'm an autistic person and I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That I found that in my own diagnosis journey as well, going through the actual assessment process, because I've been doing what I do since 2004. So I've been
Mm.
in this, I've been teaching neurodivergent kids for almost 20 years. And when I just got diagnosed a couple years ago, and there were things in the evaluation process that I remember reading or talking about and thinking, I didn't realize that doesn't apply to everybody. I
Yeah.
didn't realize that not everybody thinks that way. And again, I've been doing this for 20 years. So it's definitely, I really relate to your comment about, telling your kids, oh, that's it happens to everybody. And then you realize, oh, actually, it kind of doesn't.
Yeah. You
And
know,
I would love to ask you, Tanya, how do you feel like I know for some parents who are also neurodivergent, sometimes it makes parenting make a lot more sense because you can understand where your kiddos are coming from. You can maybe relate to them a little bit better. But I also have experienced where sometimes it actually makes the dynamics more challenging because it's multiple people with brains who that all work differently kind of coexisting together. So I'm curious from your experience, do you feel like everybody kind of coming into their own diagnosis, do you feel like that made you guys understand and be able to cohabitate together better and easier? Do you think it made it a little more challenging? What was your experience?
I think before we knew, we had a lot more conflict in our family because we didn't understand, and sometimes I think perhaps we just kind of we took each other's behavior personally. Um, I know as a mum of really young children, I found it very difficult and didn't know why. Um, I I found like just sort of like the sensory stuff of young children, the yelling, the screaming, just kind of like being kids. And I had my two eldest ones are like 18 months apart. So there's large parts of their childhood perhaps that I sort of just dissociated through because it was so hard for me. And I also like touch is a huge thing. So I would get really like touched out by my
Yeah.
kids, and I would find that really hard as well. Um, but not knowing that I was neurodivergent, I just kind of thought I was doing a bad job. Um, you know, things I kind of look back now and realize, like it was very difficult for me to get my kids to school on time because of my ADHD. And then I'd have lots of shame around that. And I'd like try to avoid the teachers because I kind of felt like they were going to come to me and say, oh, you can't get your kids to school on time, and you're so disorganized, and so, and I also realized I had a lot of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is quite common for us as well. But I didn't realize what that was. I just thought, oh, I've just got really bad anxiety, or um, I remember as a kid, my mum used to always say, "Oh, you're just so sensitive. You just take everything so personally." Um, and I also realized that I probably had a lot of that in my parenting. Like, if my children kind of perhaps reject, you know, if I perceived like they were rejecting me in some way, that would be a really big thing for me. So I think, I mean, it's a process, like you find out, and then you start doing the work and the discovery. But I really feel like it's been a great experience for us as a family to discover who we are, um, like, and how our individual brains work. And so we spend a lot of time actually just talking about um, each other and how our brains work, and also just becoming more aware of each other within that space. And if a miscommunication happens or something like that, we're a lot more compassionate towards each other. So, for instance, an example of this might be I might be talking to one of my kids, and they might be like really wanting um to info dump about something that they love. And then my brain will kind of like become perhaps bored of that because of the ADHD. And so I might start kind of like thinking about all the tasks we have to do. And so then say, like interrupt them and say, "Oh, have you done this? Have you done that?" And then like I catch myself and I go, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to invalidate what you were just saying. I am really interested. I'm sorry, my brain just went on a thought train." And then we kind of rein it back in. Um, but before I knew that, I might have just done that, and my kid might have looked at me and gone, "Oh, they're not interested, or they don't see me, or they're not listening." So, and it's just like little things like that we're able to just kind of talk to each other a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there's two things in there that I would love to talk more about. The first one I think will be shorter, so I'm going to start with that
Yeah.
one. But I really love you acknowledging circumstances where maybe you recognize that you could have made a different choice with your kiddos, right? So talking about your kiddo wanting to info dump, and then you kind of losing track of your attention. And I really value the importance of us being able to apologize to our kids when, and just like the example that you gave, in your example you apologized to him for it coming across like you weren't interested in what he was saying, or like you weren't paying attention. I'm really glad that you added that in there. It actually happened to me today with some of the students that I was in a group with. I had asked one of the kids a question and he answered it, but the information I had was telling me that his answer wasn't correct. And so I was saying, no, that can't be that. And he was saying, no, that's what it was. That's what happened. And I was like, but that doesn't make sense with what I know. And then I realized I had the wrong information, and that's why it didn't make sense. And I realized he was right the whole time. And so I apologized to him, um, just in one session, but probably three times, because I really wanted to make it clear to him that I recognized I was wrong, and that I didn't want that. I didn't want him to feel like he was wrong, because I think that's what was happening. And I really wanted to make it clear to him that I recognized I was wrong, and I wanted him to be very aware of that. So yeah, I really love that you had that in your example as well. I think it's really important that kids see how we respond to things when we realize that we're wrong. Some of our kids don't apologize at all. And I think sometimes we have to look at ourselves in those situations and make sure that we are demonstrating, number one, what that looks like. What does it look like to acknowledge that you might have said or done something that upset somebody, hurt somebody's feelings, whatever. But number two, also how quickly things move on, usually after an apology, right? And that you apologize and your child doesn't keep bringing it up, or they don't keep dragging it out, or it's an apology can be very quick and then we all move on. But I think it makes everybody so much more willing to move forward when somebody acknowledges their role in a situation, if that makes sense. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I wanted to say is I actually have never talked about RSD on this podcast. And so since you brought it up, do you want to kind of jump into this topic with me? Is that something that you're comfortable with?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So RSD is rejection sensitive dysphoria, right? Am I saying?
Yes, yeah.
Very common with ADHD, and also has some carryover into other neurodiversities as well. And it's basically where people who have this condition, this way of their brain working, we perceive things to be much more personal and much more negative, and we perceive rejection, because that's the name of it. Even a neutral conversation to us could be perceived as a negative interaction, whereas someone else may be experiencing the exact same conversation and not perceive it as negative at all. The challenge with this is lots of challenges, but it can lead to kiddos having big reactions to things where you look at that and you think, I have no idea why he or she just reacted that way. It also can lead to a lot of social anxiety. And at its core, in my opinion, is our brains misrepresenting what's happening in a negative way. And so it's very easy for people who have RSD to be much less comfortable and much less willing to put themselves out there. So they can become, I feel like I definitely used to have this pretty significantly. I feel like I don't really anymore. I think just because I've chosen to not allow it to get in my way, if that makes sense. But it's even in a lot of the Facebook groups that I'm in, it's one of the biggest topics that people talk about is being so sensitive to what other people think about them. Sometimes people will screenshot a conversation, a text conversation, and put it in a group and ask for other people's opinions. And so much of the time, other people don't perceive it as a negative interaction, but that person does. And so that's RSD. And like I said, it can really interfere with people's ability and desire and willingness to be social. It can really interfere with things at work, because there was a time in my life where every time my boss called me, I immediately assumed I was in trouble. And I worked in that place for 3 years and never was I in trouble. But every time she would call me and ask me to come see her, that was my immediate thought. And it doesn't even make sense. There's no basis for me to even think that. Okay, so that was my long rant about that. So Tanya, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's definitely like neurobiological. So it is how our brains are wired. And I also feel like it is social as well, plays into it a lot because a lot of neurodivergent children, there's this really awful statistic about, they would have heard something sort of negative about themselves or their traits, like 20,000 of those interactions by the age 10, right? So and there's also a lot of studies that I've read about, just to neurotypical teachers or um, peers, autistic or ADHD kids might appear to be less likable. And so, there's already that sort of social stigma or perception out there that I think we have to acknowledge that is very real. And so that can really feed into that natural neurobiology of a neurodivergent child to begin with. Um, I watched someone the other day and they said it's kind of like this, there's like the big T trauma, which is like,
Mhm.
like big things that happen. And then there's like the little T trauma. It's just like the little like drip, constant drip in the background of like not being understood, um, your behavior being misinterpreted, um, your gestures, the way that, and I think also, a lot of the things that we do as kids, neurodivergent kids, is like pathologized, right? Like, inappropriate play. I mean, it's just play.
Yeah.
Um, the way that we communicate, the way that we teach children inherently to mask. So there's all that plays into it as well. Um, and I also think, there is our unique neurobiology as well. A lot of like, especially women and girls in AFAB with ADHD, um, a lot of that hyperactivity that we see in boys is all internalized. We have a really busy mind. And we turn a lot of that inward towards ourselves as well.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for adding that, Tanya. That's a really great point about how just our experiences as kids can really contribute to RSD. I hadn't really thought about that perspective. That's a really great point that it is, with so much more negative feedback, it you almost come to expect negative feedback, right? When that's really what you're getting over and over, is you almost come to just expect that that's what's coming your way.
Yeah. It's kind of like a self-protection kind of mechanism, like your brain puts you on alert, and then you're like, okay, if I can anticipate the negativity that's going to come my way, the rejection, I can kind of brace myself for it, and it's not going to hurt me as much. Um, yeah, and I've had a very similar experience to you about like bosses and things, like someone will email me and say, oh, can you come just, I need to have a quick conversation with you, or oh my goodness, performance appraisals. Like I've never had a bad one, but I've always like for weeks ahead of time, as a teacher, like going into a performance appraisal, I would have the worst RSD about that. Just think that I'm going to lose my job. They're going to say all these awful things about me. Um, Replay just about every conversation I'd had with my boss, like for the year leading up to the appraisal. Um, and yeah, for our children, it can be, really, really hard too. Like just even reading in front of the class out loud or doing a presentation, um, you know, not being able to put yourself out there socially, make friends, um, you know, be part, like join a sports team, join a club, because you just have this feeling that someone's going to reject you.
Yeah, I noticed that in my program often. Even today, I noticed it with some of the kids I was working with, that just that base resistance to asking to join a group,
Mm.
um or just and I can feel how my students feel, and so in those situations I can feel that they are being overwhelmed by feelings of, if I ask, they're going to say no, or
Mm.
they're going to ignore me, or I can feel that that's what's happening so many times. And so what I'll do a lot of times is I'll say, I'll kind of do some modeling and some encouraging, and especially like in my program, the kids just by nature don't reject each other. That's not typically a thing that happens. And so because I know that, it gives me a really great environment to reinforce, so I might say something like, I know that if you ask them if you can join them, they're going to say yes. I know that. And so, do you want me to stand next to you when you do that? And sometimes I'll even say something like, I might go up to the group and say, hey guys, if somebody were to ask if they could play this game with you, what would you guys say? Right. And then I'm like, oh yeah, So I always just like to reinforce, because at least in my environment, I don't want to say I have control of it. I can predict the outcome. And so it's a really great place for me to support kids that I can feel are struggling with that concept of being concerned about, asking to join a game, or because the kids, for the most part in my program, they don't reject each other. They don't tell each other, no, you can't play here, because we're all in this together. So I had another point I wanted to make about it. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is that I think one of the reasons that I really had to train myself to not be so affected by rejection sensitive dysphoria is because I run a business. And oh my gosh, there's anytime somebody doesn't register, anytime somebody leaves my program, even things like if I post something on social media and nobody responds, holy cow. At the beginning, all of those things used to be a really big deal to me. You cannot run a business that way. And so now I'm just over it. What I can see, even on social media, if I'll post videos or things like that, very few people engage. Even on this podcast, hardly anybody leaves a review or a rating. And if I just look at that on the surface, it kind of hurts my heart, right? Because it's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, it's free, I mean, I'm trying to do all this to be helpful, but I can see my statistics. I can see how many people are listening to this every week. I can go on my Facebook page and I can see how many people opened a post or watched a video. Or so I've learned that there are far more far different measures, I guess, because even, if you're scrolling on social media, how often do you really love something or like something or comment on something, right? Not that often. But I can see how many people are looking at the stuff that I post. I can see who's watching, not who, but how many people are watching videos. And I can see, that the podcast is growing and growing and growing. And so I just choose to focus on what I can see is working and is benefiting people, because I think as a business owner, it would be almost impossible to run a business that you are in charge of and struggle with RSD, because it's so easy to make almost everything a case for somebody rejecting you, right? And in reality, nothing has to do with me, right? I mean, people cannot register for 27 different reasons. People can leave the program for 49 different reasons. I mean, it's never about me. It's always everybody's own reasons and whatever's going on in their life. So I think that was a big thing, is I realized I could not run a business and struggle so much with RSD. The two are not compatible.
I totally get what you're saying, because when I first started my own business, just the act, like I love writing blog posts, and it's kind of like, I don't know, I think it's a bit of like a love language for me. I love doing them, I love putting them out into the world. But I remember my very first blog post that I wrote, it took me like a week to work through the feelings and the rejection that I felt I was going to get, and how I would upset like someone that I didn't even know on the internet by posting something. And so I had to, like, I've worked with a lot of coaches, a lot of people throughout my professional career to help me to break down some of those beliefs behind the RSD.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally get what you say about the posts because, like I post things too, and well, I post a video and I'm like, that got like zero people commented, zero people did anything with it. And then I will go out into my community and I'll see someone and they'll say, hey, that was a really great video you posted. It really helped me. And, I just really, really loved it. Thank you so much for posting it. And I think, okay, so, but nobody like engaged with it at all. But I also realized that sometimes, like I post a lot of stuff about trauma, about, you know, parenting stuff that perhaps some people find hard. And so everybody's on their own journey with this stuff. And so they might not feel comfortable engaging with it in a public way, but they still would have found what they needed and engaged with it in a way that felt really helpful to them. So, yeah, I totally get what you mean about those sort of vanity metrics, and, in opposed to what's actually real and meaningful for people.
Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting. The vanity metrics, right? How many people liked it? How many people shared it? Whatever. And I think for me, it's. I just want to make sure that I'm providing value to people. I want to make sure that the things I'm talking about and sharing are things that people are interested in and care about. And so it becomes hard to know that sometimes, if people
Mhm.
aren't leaving reviews or, it becomes hard to know. But yeah, I think that's where I look at the number of podcast plays and even when I send out, so I do a weekly email, and I can see how many people open it, and the open rates for my emails are actually really high. And so that makes me feel really good that hopefully in the things that I'm talking about, that people at least care enough to open the emails. But yeah, I think sometimes it's just about finding a different way to gauge how people feel about things. I really want to talk more about what you share with parents in the world just about parenting neurodivergent kiddos. I know that some of the things that are really focus points for you are the concept of a connection focused relationship with your kiddos, attachment, right? Having secure attachments, affirming their neurodivergence, and even earlier you mentioned about how some neurodivergent behaviors become pathologized, right? And the whole, and in my world, there's no such thing as right or wrong or good or bad. But that's very often at home, at school, in therapies and other places. There's very much a normal and a not normal, right? And so I think I would really love whichever one of those topics you want to start on. I would love to hear more about just what's important to you and what you share with other parents.
So first of all, my first sort of thing, the thing that I think is the most important thing, um, is radical acceptance. And what I mean by that is kind of throwing out the rule book when it comes to parenting, um, and also just parenting the child that you have. I think there is so much like programming or perception of like how your parenting journey should go, what your child should be like, how they should turn out, what successful parenting looks like, what success in general looks like for a human being. And a lot of that actually doesn't apply to neurodivergent people, neurodivergent families. And so the first thing that I really want to just kind of put out to parents is that radical acceptance is going to be your friend. And so that means looking at your child, looking at your family, and deciding what actually works for us. The second one is just like realizing that your child is they are whole and complete and worthy of love and respect and belonging just by being themselves, you know. So a thing I often say is like, nobody's broken, nobody needs to be fixed. We need to just accept who we are as human beings and accept our child for who they are. Because the longer we hold on to this idea of like what normal looks like or what, you know, the longer we kind of just stay in grief because we're grieving that sort of thing that we should have had. And it actually breaks down the connection that we have with our child because we we're not seeing the child in front of us. We're not parenting the child in front of us. We're trapped in our emotions. We're trapped in our should haves and all that kind of thing. And so that's kind of like the first barrier to connection. And then with like connection first or connection focused or attachment, it's kind of like just I spend a lot of time with my children when they talk to me about their experience, just trying to put myself in their shoes, trying to understand their perspective. And like, you know, sometimes as parents, we want to go in there, we want to fix, we want to problem solve, we want to do all that kind of thing. Um, but if we're genuinely wanting to um, make any kind of like change in our children's lives or improve, we have to have the connection first. We have to like validate their experience, their emotions, and just treat them with genuine empathy. You know, apologize when we're wrong, um, and believe them. Believe them when they tell us that this is their view of the world, like you said with with your student. Um, and then like actually just affirming who our children are. So um, helping them to see their own uniqueness. And I think the best way of doing that is by us as parents embracing who we are, talking about our brains, the way things work, and even if we have neurotypical brains, and just kind of making space in our family for those conversations, normalizing differences. Um, that is probably one of the most affirming things that we can do as parents for our children. Um, and then, did I talk about all four? But yeah, those are the kinds of things that I teach parents. So to me, neuroaffirming isn't just a nice little label that we put onto things. It's actually working with that parent, that child, and their unique brains. It's not like a cookie cutter kind of, you know, thing like that we all need to fit into. So if a parent works with me, we talk about their individual circumstances, what works for them, what works for their child's sensory profile, and ways that the parent can adapt their approach to meet that specific child. And we might have, if you've got multiple children, like I've got three, they might all need different things from you. So, how we can make that work within a family dynamic as well.
Yeah, I love those concepts so much. I wanted to just throw out a couple examples that I could think of off the top of my head in terms of just affirming the differences and giving different kids what they need. Even so, I'm thinking about in my in-person program, in the space that we were in, we had multiple rooms. And the reason for that was because by default, the biggest room that we had would be the loudest because the most kids would be in there. But I also had another room that just became the room that the kids went to if they didn't want it to be so loud. So kids who like to play more like maybe chess or, more of the strategy type game, but they needed concentration, they would automatically go to this other room where there was a table and chairs, but there were much less kids in there. And so by default, it was just a quieter, calmer space. And then we had a third room it was just an empty room. And so that became the room that the kids went to when they were pretend playing, because then they're running around, right? So not only are they loud and chaotic, they're also mobile. But
Yeah.
that at any given time, there are 3 different spaces that kids can choose to be in, right? They can choose to be in the chaotic, running around space. They can choose kind of the intermediate space where people aren't running around, but there's a lot of people, or they can go to this calm, quiet space. And it was just really nice to be able to have different options for it. And I didn't even set it up that way intentionally. It just kind of played out that way. But I really like that everybody was able to go to the place that they felt the most comfortable. And I'm also thinking of a kiddo that did a lot of verbal stimming, a lot of really loud noises, and then also a lot of, running. So at the same time, usually running and a lot of loud noises. And so if we're working on a project or an activity or having a discussion or whatever, I would just give him the choice if he wanted to stay in the group and do what we were doing. He can always walk around. He can always move. Just being able to minimize the vocalizations, or he could go into one of the other rooms and run around and vocalize all he wanted to. But just with that awareness that in this group at this time, we're working on something where we're being quieter or where we're having to listen to other people or, whatever the case may be. So sometimes he chooses to stay in the group and minimize vocalization. Sometimes he chooses to go to the other room and be as loud as he wants to be. And the same when we would do meditation in summer camp. I have a student who doesn't have the ability to keep her thoughts in her brain. And so everything she thinks is just a constant verbalization, right? She just doesn't have that ability. And so for meditation, she would go into her own room and hang out there. And so everybody else is in a different room being quiet and calm, and she's in another room just chatting to herself,
Yeah.
But instead of the kids feeling like they shouldn't be doing those things, or that nobody else is doing those things, or stop doing those things, it's just, here's a different environment. It might not match with what we're doing here in this environment, and sometimes it does. Sometimes it's totally fine for anybody to be running around and saying whatever they want to say and doing whatever, but just helping them know that there's nothing bad or wrong about it. It just might be interfering with the task that we're doing, but you can go do that somewhere else. Absolutely. Totally fine.
Yeah, and that's so affirming for our children, and also just like validating that their needs are valid, their needs are okay, and that we don't have to change who we are as a person to fit in with the norm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, for the parents that I work with, we talk about, how can we create that safe space for their child to be able to unmask and do the things that they need to do in their home. Because our children, in mainstream sort of settings, they do spend a lot of time masking, and they could put a lot of pressure on a child, and actually cause a lot of damage and trauma for them.
Yeah. And Tanya, let's talk more about masking, because that is another thing that I know has been mentioned in a lot of my episodes, but I don't know that I've ever had an explicit conversation about that topic. And so I think this would be a great time to just really explicitly talk about the concept of masking. Masking is, I mean, it can apply to everybody, but it typically is much more prominent in people who either feel like they don't fit in to the world that they're in, or who have experienced that they don't fit into the world that they're in. So when we talk about it with our neurodivergent kiddos and us as adults, it's the concept of it's masking refers to putting on a mask, right? So it's pretending to be somebody that you are not, and the objective is to fit in, because we live in a social society. We live in a, we're tribal people. There is safety and security in the concept of fitting into the group. And so as human beings, we all have this need to belong and to fit in. And so a lot of times what will happen when people feel like they don't fit in is they will pretend. So some of the things that we were talking about that may be, things that kiddos say or do because of their neurodivergence, they may stop saying or doing those things because of the feedback that they get from other people. We talked earlier about the amount of negative, corrections and things like that happen. And so sometimes you can even get kids who develop social anxiety and stop communicating with people in general because they're so concerned about how other people will perceive them. And so we all have some masking that is probably appropriate and necessary, right? Like there are certain things that we should not really do in front of our coworkers, or, when we're at a wedding, and I mean, there's definitely, nobody goes around being 100% authentic all the time, because there's some settings where, just the expectations are a little bit different. But so, Tanya, like you were saying, school is an environment where sometimes kids mask all day long because they're trying not to get in trouble. They're trying not to get called out. They're trying not to, create a negative reputation for themselves. And it can definitely lead to mental health challenges because you are not being you, right? You are not being who you are.
And, sometimes, I did a lot of research on particularly girls. And, the way that we socialize, especially our young girls, is, around pleasing others, around making other people feel more comfortable around us. So, the social cues and the things. So, for a neurodivergent person or young person, they might spend a lot of time watching other people into how they interact. So to find out how to be normal. Um, they might watch things I remember as a kid watching things on television, how actors and actresses acted and creating a persona around that particular sort of person or character that you sort of admire, to kind of try to fit in or to be cool. You would probably spend a lot of time practicing how to not eye contact, but look at people in the face. And then you also resist things like having stimming, or even like the way that neurodivergent people communicate. So, you spend a lot of time thinking, okay, no, don't info dump, don't info dump, don't info dump. This is the way that I should be talking. Like practicing how to use small talk and stuff like that, which is very hard for us. Or, I see a lot of autistic girls in early childhood who try really hard to fit in with the types of play that they should be playing. And so it's kind of like just denying all those or suppressing all those neurodivergent traits. But we need to be able to communicate in that way. We need to stim in order to regulate our nervous systems. And so for a lot of parents, what they see is their child goes to school, suppresses everything, masks it, and then it's kind of like the Coke bottle that's kind of shook up all day. And then when they get home and it feels like a safe space for them, then the meltdowns happen, the explosions happen. because their child had to suppress that the whole time, which then um, has long-term consequences for our children because, their mental health struggles, they might go into burnout, and it might make it difficult for them, especially in the high school sort of years where they have so many more demands, that it might make it difficult for them to even finish school or stay in school because it's just, the masking has been so hard for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's obviously one of the things I'm a really big fan of is our kids having connections to other people who are like them. Right. I
Mm,
think it's I cannot overemphasize that enough, how important that is. And I think that's just another reason is because even, it's interesting because even the kiddos I was talking about earlier that, the one who does a lot of verbal stimming and the one kiddo who's just always talking, in my environment, the other kids, sometimes when kids are newer, they're a little put off by that. But then they just notice that none of the other kids care. None of the other kids are really bothered by it. And so I think it's, in my environment, the kids learn to give each other social feedback. But about stuff like that, it's interesting how nobody really cares. Nobody really
mm,
cares if somebody's running around the room. Nobody, you know what I'm saying? A lot of the things, there's even been a couple times where I have either given somebody feedback about something or thought about it and then realized none of the other kids care. And that was on me for thinking that it was something that even needed to be, addressed because nobody else even cared about it. So I think it's even topics of conversation, right? The topics of conversation amongst the kids in my program tend to be much more immature than what their age peers are talking about.
mm,
But they're all talking about it together in my program. There's not anybody whose interests are more immature than other kids. They're all talking about it together. So my point being, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but point being that I think talking about the concept of masking is just another reason why it's so important for our neurodivergent kiddos to be around other kids who are like them. Because as long as they're in an emotionally safe, supportive environment, there is no need for masking. And the
mm.
things that they typically say or do or whatever, most of the time, other neurodivergent kids, sometimes they don't even notice it. Or if they do, it's just not a thing. Um, so yeah, okay. Sometimes I feel like
Yeah.
I have to keep adding words to my sentences.
And I think it's kind of funny that you say that sometimes if you look back, like, if you were diagnosed later and you look back at your friends that were like your really good friends, they might not be diagnosed themselves, but they probably are neurodivergent in some way too. We just tend to attract other people who get us, and that we can kind of be ourselves and weird with together, right? And so, yeah, it's quite interesting when you look back at your friendships, the ones that were really important to you as a kid, and you kind of like, oh yeah, I can see that they probably were were a bit neurodivergent themselves.
I often ask parents that if when I have new students that come into the program, if they do say that they have friends and their parents, corroborate that, I will then ask, are their friends like them? Right.
Yeah,
And when I say that, the parents immediately know what I'm asking. And the answer is always yes. Right. That
yeah,
we are, because we feel understood and we feel, like we feel emotionally safe. And yeah, I definitely find that for my neurodivergent students, if they do have friends outside of my program, it is other kids who are like them.
yeah.
And that's the case. I mean, even if we're not talking about neurodivergence, we all gravitate toward people that we can relate to. That could be,
Mm.
maybe we live in the same neighborhood. Maybe we gravitate toward people who are from where we're from. If we live somewhere else later in life, we gravitate toward people who are the same culture as us, the same religion as us, that have the same hobbies as us. Family structure, we
Mm.
all do that. We Very few people seek out other groups that they don't relate to in order to spend time, with people in those groups.
Yeah.
We're just, again, we're tribal creatures. And so that feels very comfortable and familiar to us when other people think like us, talk like us, act like us. If you can imagine, if you've ever been in another place where people are speaking a different language and you hear somebody speaking your language, man.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's it's important for everybody to be able to find people that they can relate to. I think the importance for our kiddos is even greater because of all the things we've been talking about today: the masking, the RSD, just a lot of the challenges that our kiddos face because of who they are. I think it makes it even that much more important that they find people that they don't feel like those things are a challenge for them in those situations.
Yeah, I think, when you do find that plate, that sort of there's environments of where you truly feel like you belong. It's such a big protective factor for our children, for their well-being, for their mental health. It's so important for affirming who they are, because if you have that genuine connection, and that's why I say it's so important for us as parents as well, because we can be that place of safety for our children. And those social interactions with other neurodivergent children can also be that place of safety where you can you can really discover who you are, you can be yourself, and it just feels it just feels good to your nervous system. I know, like, I have a friend who we can just kind of like be in the same room doing things together, and we don't constantly have to be talking and interacting, but we get each other, we understand each other, and it just feels so good, like it feels like just like like a big breath of fresh air, or being able to take a deep breath around them. And I think that's sort of like how it is for our children as well. When they have people around them that get them, that
Mhm.
understand them, where they can be themselves, it's kind of like their nervous system is just like taking a big sigh, like just like, I can relax here. I can be myself.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've been doing a lot of podcast interviews lately. I actually, at the time that we're recording this, I just started having guests on my podcast. Before this, it was always me or me and my coworker. And so I've had, at this point, probably 12 interviews for people on my show. And most of them are neurodivergent because this is the conversation, right? This is what we're
Mm,
talking about. And I felt like every interview that I've done has been, for me at least, really comfortable. And, it's been a really good flow of conversation. I would say there's only been one that I would say maybe that wasn't quite the case, and that person was not neurodivergent. But I feel like in every other situation, because we don't know each other, right? You and I have
mm.
never met before this day, and that's how all of my interviews. I haven't interviewed anybody that I actually know. So at Starfish Social Club, we call those acquaintances, right?
Yeah,
Like, I know your name, I know, but I don't actually
yeah.
know you. But I feel that even doing these interviews, that there's just this innate connection that I have with certain people because we have similar lived experiences. And
Mm.
yeah, my cat is, I hope you guys cannot hear her. She's so needy. And so she's just sitting on the floor. Meow, meow, meow. Um, she's
I have a cat.
precious, but she's needy.
I've got a black cat in the room too. I'm surprised he hasn't been up here on my desk as well, because sometimes he sleeps on my desk or by the windowsill.
Yeah, if you're watching this on video, you will have seen her tail at least twice so far during this episode. I'm trying to keep her in my lap, but she's kind of hard to contain. Okay, Tanya, before we go, is there anything else that you would like to share or touch on or talk about?
Um, no, I feel like I just wanted to just validate what you said, Steph, and just say it's been really lovely talking to you too. I've just felt like this has just been a conversation with someone I've known for ages. So thank you so much for that. I think it's really important for us as adults to also be in communities with other neurokin, and to meet people with similar lived experiences. Even if, we've just met them and we're in totally different countries and different culture, I feel like neurodivergent culture is something that perhaps isn't encouraged enough in adults. And yeah, it's just really lovely to meet another neurokin.
Yeah, I've never heard that term before, neurokin. I've never heard that. So thank you for teaching me a new term today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
That's so awesome. Okay, Tanya, please tell everybody where they can find you online and learn more about you and what you do.
So I'm on both Facebook and Instagram. My handle is Tanya Valentin NZ on both those places. And then I also have a website. So it's just tanyavalentin.co.
So
Um,
because she's in New Zealand, so just
yeah,
I'll put it in text and everything, but just for anybody who's listening, not com.
yeah. I did have a com, but then I kind of lost it. And then, yeah, as I said, mentioned before, I might have mentioned to Steph before we started, my children, well, my family, my husband, myself, and my kids, we all have our own podcast where we talk about we don't have guests or anything. We just talk about our experiences as a neurodivergent family. And we also talk a little bit about LGBTQ stuff as well, because all my children are part of the LGBTQ plus community. So, and my husband and I we're allies. Um, so yeah, it's quite a um, good conversation sometimes. So if families are wanting to hear what it's like in the conversations, it can be quite helpful. So yeah, and that's called the Seen, Heard, Accepted podcast.
My biggest request for parents of neurodivergent kiddos is to, number one, do what you can to try to understand your kiddo. Oh, that reminds me of what else I was going to say. So do what you can to try to understand your kiddo, even if you don't try to, right? Because I think that I always felt very misunderstood as a kiddo, like just very misunderstood. And I think that's the one thing that if parents can work on that or accomplish that, whatever, I think that would make such a big difference. But our gender identity is part of who we are. And so in our efforts to understand who our kids are, their gender identity is who they are. So that's the point I wanted to make about that. The other thing that I forgot and now I remember is I also think that if I'm going to say the royal we, if the royal we are advocates for acceptance and awareness of anything, we have to be advocates of acceptance and awareness of everything. I think, to me, it's a little illogical to do, autism walks and, ADHD, month of October, like awareness month, but not advocate for people who, are transgender or people who are a different race or religion. I just think it's this whole concept of acceptance and awareness is all or nothing. I don't think we can
Absolutely.
pick and choose who we allow to be themselves and who we don't. So
Yeah, yes. I totally agree with what you've just said there, Steph. Yeah, that is so important. And yeah, and I think, just as parents, if we're wanting to love, accept, affirm our children, we have to love, accept, and affirm totally who they are, as a human being. And we don't we don't get to pick that. We don't get to pick that as parents. Um, we bring our children into this world, and then they kind of unfold and discover who they are in front of us. And we need to be in that support role, not the person that's kind of engineering the journey.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Tanya,
Yeah.
thank you so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate it. Thank you
Oh,
to everybody
pleasure.
for joining us this week. And I will see you again next week. I'm really glad that you're here.